You will never believe what happened when a ragged boy asked a millionaire man for help. What this man discovered will make you question everything. It seems like just another story of someone asking for help, right? But this specific request had a hidden secret. At 52, Matthew had everything money could buy. The penthouse overlooking Central Park, a collection of rare vintage cars, and a reputation as one of Wall Street's most ruthless success stories. Yet each morning, as he prepared to face another day of board meetings and billion-dollar decisions, an inexplicable emptiness echoed through his carefully curated life. This particular morning felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Perhaps it was the way the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, or how the usual cacophony of the city seemed muted, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As his private elevator descended to the garage level, Matthew checked his phone. 3 missed calls from the board, 2 urgent emails about a pending merger, and a reminder about his afternoon squash game at the exclusive Metropolitan Club. The usual morning symphony of obligations and expectations. The garage was temperature-controlled, housing his collection of automotive masterpieces. Today, he chose the midnight blue Bentley Continental, its engine purring to life with a gentle press of the starter button. The sound reverberated off the concrete walls, a mechanical lullaby that usually brought him comfort. But today it felt hollow. As the garage door opened to the private exit, something caught his eye, a figure, small and hunched, standing just beyond the security gate. Matthew's first instinct was to ignore it. Years in New York had taught him that engagement often led to complications. But as he drew closer, he could make out more details. A boy, probably no more than 12 or 13, wearing clothes that had long since lost their original color and shape. The security system should have prevented anyone from getting this close to the building's entrance. Matthew made a mental note to have a word with the head of security. He pressed the button to lower his window, intending to tell the boy to move along, but the words died in his throat when their eyes met. There was something in those eyes, a familiar pain, a depth of suffering that seemed out of place in someone so young. The boy's face was smudged with dirt, but beneath the grime, his features held a strange nobility, an echo of something Matthew couldn't quite place. "Please, sir," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need help finding my family." Matthew's finger hovered over the window control. He'd heard every possible story on the streets of New York. Tales of lost families, sick relatives, bus tickets needed to reach distant salvation. He'd learned to shut them out, to build walls around his compassion. It was easier that way, cleaner. But the boy didn't launch into a rehearsed story. He simply stood there, his eyes fixed on Matthew with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. There was no theatrical desperation, no calculated play for sympathy. Just that steady gaze and those 6 words hanging in the morning air. "There are shelters for that," Matthew found himself saying, his voice rougher than he intended. "Social services. People who handle these things." The boy shook his head slowly. "They can't help me. Not with this." He took a small step forward, and Matthew noticed he was barefoot, his feet covered in small cuts and bruises. "I've been looking for so long, and when I saw your name in the paper..." He trailed off, swallowing hard. Matthew's hand tightened on the steering wheel. "My name? What about my name?" "Sterling," the boy said softly. "That's your name, isn't it? Matthew Sterling." A chill ran down Matthew's spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. There was something in the way the boy said his name, Sam. Anything that tugged at memories he'd spent years trying to forget. "Who are you?" Matthew demanded, but his voice had lost its edge of authority. The boy seemed to shrink slightly under the question, as if the weight of the answer was too heavy for his thin shoulders. "My name is Sam," he said finally, "and I think you might be the only person who can help me find out who I really am." Matthew's carefully ordered world tilted slightly on its axis. He should drive away. He had meetings, obligations, a whole day mapped out in 15-minute increments. He had spent decades building walls around himself, creating a fortress of wealth and influence that kept the messy, complicated parts of life at bay. But there was something about the boy, about Sam, that made those walls feel suddenly fragile. Perhaps it was the way he stood, with a quiet dignity that defied his ragged appearance. Or maybe it was something deeper, something that resonated with a part of Matthew's soul he thought he'd buried long ago. Against every instinct honed by years of protecting himself from the world's endless demands, Matthew found himself reaching for the door handle. The leather seat creaked as he stepped out of the car, his expensive shoes meeting the concrete of the driveway. "You have 5 minutes," he said, trying to maintain some semblance of his usual authority. "Tell me why you're really here." Sam's shoulders straightened slightly, and in that moment, Matthew saw a flash of something familiar in his posture, like looking at an old photograph that had been blurred by time and memory. The boy took a deep breath, and as he began to speak, the morning traffic faded away. The city held its breath, and Matthew Sterling's carefully constructed world began its inevitable transformation. The security cameras recorded the scene in silence. A man in a $1,000 suit standing in his private driveway, listening to a barefoot boy in torn clothes. Neither of them knew it yet, but this moment would ripple through their lives like a stone cast in a still water, changing everything in its wake. Sam's story came out in pieces, like a puzzle scattered by the wind. He spoke of foster homes and street corners, of searching through newspaper clippings and following whispered rumors. But it was what he didn't say that caught Matthew's attention. The pauses between words, the way his eyes would drift to the ground when certain topics arose, as if some memories were too heavy to hold while maintaining eye contact. "My father," Sam said, his voice catching slightly on the word. "He used to tell me stories about his family, about a brother who became successful in New York. He had a picture, but he lost it when he trailed off, his hands twisting the hem of his worn shirt." Matthew felt something shift in his chest, a key turning in a lock he'd forgotten existed. "Your father," he said carefully, each word feeling like it might shatter something precious. "What was his name?" Sam looked up, and in that moment, the morning sun caught his face just right, illuminating features that seemed to step out of Matthew's memories. "James," he said simply. "James Sterling." The name hit Matthew like a physical blow. James, his younger brother, the one who disappeared 15 years ago after a bitter argument about money and family obligations. The brother whose absence had left a void that Matthew had filled with acquisitions and achievements, trying to drown out the echo of their last angry words. Matthew's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, probably the board wondering why he wasn't at the morning meeting. For the first time in his career, he didn't reach for it. Instead, he found himself studying Sam's face, really looking at him, seeing past the dirt and exhaustion to something that made his heart constrict. The boy had James's eyes, the same deep brown that could convey volumes without saying a word, the same slight tilt at the corners when something caught his interest. Even the way he stood, with his weight shifted slightly to one side, was pure James. "Come inside," Matthew heard himself say, the words surprising them both. "We need to talk." Sam hesitated, glancing at the imposing building behind them. "I don't want to cause trouble. I needed to know if you were really him, if you could help me understand where I come from." Matthew's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his key card. "I think," he said slowly, "we might be able to help each other with that." As they walked toward the private elevator, Matthew felt the weight of years of carefully maintained distance beginning to crack. He had spent so long building his empire, creating a world where everything could be controlled, measured, and managed. But now, with each step they took together, that world was shifting, transforming into something both terrifying and strangely hopeful. The elevator doors closed behind them with a soft whisper, and as they began their ascent, Matthew caught their reflection in the polished brass panels. A study in contrasts, the successful businessman and the street urchin, connected by a thread of blood and memory that had refused to break despite years of neglect. Sam stood perfectly still, his bare feet leaving slight smudges on the marble floor. He seemed both younger and older than his years, a child worn down by life, but holding on to something unbreakable within. Matthew found himself wondering what James would think of this moment, of his son standing in his brother's private elevator, bringing with him questions that had gone unanswered for far too long. As they rose above the city, neither of them spoke. The silence was filled with the weight of unasked questions and the possibility of answers that might change everything. Matthew Sterling, who had built his life on calculated decisions and careful control, felt himself stepping into unknown territory, guided by nothing more than the echo of his brother's eyes in the face of a boy who had appeared like a ghost from his past. The morning sun continued its climb over Manhattan, casting long shadows through the glass walls of Matthew's penthouse. But for once, he wasn't thinking about the day ahead, about meetings or mergers, or maintaining his carefully crafted image. Instead, his mind was traveling backward, to a time when family meant more than legacy, when wealth was measured in moments shared rather than dollars earned. As the elevator continued its smooth ascent, Matthew realized that while he had spent years building his fortune, the true price of that fortune was only now beginning to reveal itself. His attention was fixed on Sam's reflection in the glass. The way the boy's eyes widened slightly at the sight of such luxury, then quickly returned to their guarded expression. "Would you like something to eat?" Matthew asked, the words feeling strange in his mouth. When was the last time he'd offered anyone food in his home? His housekeeper handled all such matters when he hosted business dinners, creating perfect tablescapes that looked better in photographs than they did in reality. Sam shook his head, then nodded, then shook it again, a small battle between pride and hunger playing out in his movements. "I'm fine," he said, but his stomach betrayed him with a quiet growl that echoed in the marble foyer. Matthew found himself walking to his kitchen, a space he rarely entered, with its professional-grade appliances that mostly served as expensive decorations. He opened the refrigerator, staring at its sparse contents: imported mineral water, protein shakes, and pre-prepared meals in sleek black containers. "I don't," he started, then stopped, embarrassed by the realization that his kitchen, like much of his life, was more about appearance than substance. "Let me call down for something." But Sam had already spotted a fruit bowl on the counter, another carefully curated display that Matthew's housekeeper maintained. The boy's eyes fixed on an apple, red and perfect like something from a fairy tale. Matthew nodded, and Sam took it, holding it in both hands as if it were made of crystal. "Your father," Matthew said, watching as Sam carefully polished the apple on his tattered shirt. "He loved apples. Used to climb the trees in our backyard in Connecticut, even after Mom told him he was too old for such things." The memory rose unbidden, sharp and clear despite the years he'd spent trying to forget. Sam took a small bite, chewing thoughtfully. "He used to cut them into stars," he said quietly. Said that's how his mom taught him to do it. Said it made them taste better. Matthew's throat tightened. Their mother had indeed cut apples into stars, carefully removing the core in 5 precise cuts. He hadn't thought about that in years, had buried it along with so many other memories of a life that seemed to belong to someone else now. "How?" Matthew cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "How long has it been since you've seen him?" Sam's fingers traced patterns on the apple skin. 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days, he said with the precision of someone who had counted each sunrise. "We were living in Boston then. Dad had a job at a construction site. It was good for a while. We had an apartment, and he was teaching me about building things." He took another small bite, chewing slowly as if to make it last. "Then there was an accident. Dad fell. The hospital bills." He trailed off, his shoulders hunching slightly. Matthew felt the weight of those unfinished sentences. How many times had James needed help? How many times had his pride, or was it Matthew's own arrogance, kept him from reaching out? "After that, we moved around a lot," Sam continued, his voice taking on the flat tone of someone reciting facts to keep emotions at bay. "Dad tried to keep working, but his back was never the same. We stayed in shelters sometimes, or in the car when we still had it. Then one morning, he went out to look for work and—" Sam's voice cracked slightly. "He didn't come back." The apple trembled in Sam's hands. Matthew found himself reaching out, then stopping, his hands suspended in the space between them like a bridge unfinished. What right did he have to offer comfort now, after so many years of absence? "I waited at the shelter for 3 days, Sam said, each word carefully measured. "The staff said they'd call social services. I left before they could. Dad always said if anything happened to him, I should find his family. Said his brother would know what to do, even if they hadn't spoken in years. Matthew turned away, ostensibly to get a glass of water, but really to hide the emotions he could feel breaking through his carefully maintained facade. He'd spent 15 years building walls around his heart, creating a fortress of wealth and influence that kept the messy, complicated parts of life at bay. But now, listening to his nephew describe years of hardship that he could have prevented with a fraction of his fortune, those walls were crumbling. "I looked for you," Sam continued, his voice stronger now. "In libraries, on computers when I could get to them. Your name was in business magazines, on websites. But getting close to you," he gestured at the opulent surroundings. "It's not easy to reach someone who lives in a place like this." Matthew turned back, water glass in hand, to find Sam standing straighter, chin lifted slightly, a posture so reminiscent of James that it made his chest ache. The boy had finished the apple and was holding the core carefully, looking for a place to dispose of it. "There's more food," Matthew said quickly, moving to the refrigerator again. "I can order anything you want. And clothes? You need clothes and shoes." He was babbling now, falling back on the one thing he knew how to do: throw money at problems. "What I need," Sam said quietly but firmly, "is to find my dad. He wouldn't just leave. Something must have happened to him. And if anyone has the resources to find out what, it's you." Matthew looked at his nephew, really looked at him. Beyond the dirt and worn clothes, he saw James's determination, their mother's quiet strength, and something uniquely Sam's own, a resilience that had carried him through years of uncertainty to this moment. The morning sun had risen fully now, painting the penthouse in shades of gold and making the dust motes dance in the air like tiny stars. Outside, the city continued its eternal rhythm, but inside this bubble of marble and glass, time seemed to hold its breath. Matthew's phone buzzed again, probably his assistant, wondering why he wasn't at the office, why he wasn't responding to urgent emails, why he had suddenly deviated from the carefully plotted course of his life. For the first time in years, he didn't care. "Tell me everything," he said, pulling out one of the elegant bar stools that lined his kitchen island. "Start from the beginning. Leave nothing out." He sat down, indicating that Sam should do the same. "It's time I started acting like the uncle I should have been all along." Sam hesitated for a moment, then climbed onto the adjacent stool. His feet, dirty and scratched, dangled well above the floor, a reminder of just how young he was, despite everything he'd been through. He placed the apple core carefully on the counter, then folded his hands in his lap, gathering his thoughts. Outside, a cloud passed over the sun, momentarily dimming the penthouse. In that brief shadow, Matthew saw his life choices with stark clarity. The pursuit of wealth at the cost of family, the building of an empire on a foundation of forgotten obligations. But as the sun emerged again, he also saw a chance for redemption, delivered by a barefoot boy who had crossed the city, carrying nothing but hope and an unshakable determination to find his family. As Sam began to speak, his voice gaining strength with each word, Matthew made a silent promise to his absent brother. He would make this right. He would use every resource at his disposal, every connection he'd built, every dollar he'd earned, to find James and rebuild what had been broken. And more importantly, he would be the uncle, the family that Sam deserved. The story that unfolded over the next few hours would change both their lives forever, though neither of them knew it yet. It was a tale of loss and survival, of hope maintained against impossible odds, and of the unbreakable bonds of family that persist even when we try to deny them. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Matthew's phone fell silent. His appointments went unattended, and the carefully ordered world he'd built began its transformation into something messier but infinitely more meaningful. The price of his fortune had been high, but perhaps it wasn't too late to spend it on something truly valuable. In the kitchen of his luxury penthouse, listening to his nephew's story, Matthew Sterling began the journey from being merely wealthy to becoming truly rich. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: the warmth of family, the weight of responsibility not to shareholders but to blood, and the bittersweet ache of a heart beginning to thaw after years of winter. The city sprawled below them, a maze of possibilities and dangers, somewhere in which James Sterling might still be found. But for now, in this moment, two lost pieces of a broken family had found each other, and that was a beginning worth more than all the wealth in Manhattan. Sam's voice continued, weaving a tapestry of memories and hopes, while outside, the autumn sun traced its arc across the sky, witnessing the quiet miracle of connection reborn in a place where money had once been the only measure of worth. The price of fortune was being recalculated, and it's true. Value had nothing to do with the numbers in Matthew Sterling's bank accounts. As the story unfolded, the penthouse seemed to grow warmer, more alive, as if the space itself was transforming from a showcase of wealth into something that might, with time and care, become a home. The morning that had begun with a chance encounter at a security gate was stretching into an afternoon of revelations, each word between uncle and nephew building a bridge across the years of silence and separation. Matthew found himself learning to listen in a way he hadn't in years, not for opportunities or advantages, but for the simple truth of human experience. Each detail Sam shared was a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was missing, filling gaps in his understanding not just of his nephew's life, but of his own choices and their far-reaching consequences. The sun continued its journey across the sky, casting ever-changing patterns through the floor-to-ceiling windows, while below them, the city carried on its endless dance of commerce and ambition. But within the penthouse, time moved to a different rhythm, marked not by meetings and deadlines, but by the steady flow of words between two people discovering what it meant to be family. The price of fortune, Matthew was beginning to understand, could be measured not in dollars lost, but in connections found, not in opportunities missed, but in chances for redemption seized. As Sam's story continued to unfold, the true cost and value of everything Matthew had built began to reveal itself in ways he had never expected. In the gathering afternoon light, uncle and nephew sat together, surrounded by all the trappings of wealth, yet focused only on the priceless currency of shared truth and growing understanding. The day that had begun with a simple encounter was transforming into something far more valuable, a chance to redefine what truly constituted a fortune worth having. As afternoon light began to soften into evening, Matthew realized they had been talking for hours. His stomach growled, reminding him that neither of them had eaten properly. Sam's story had carried them through the day, punctuated only by occasional sips of water and that single apple. "We need food," Matthew said, interrupting a detailed description of the Boston shelter where Sam had last seen his father. The words came out more gently than his usual commands. Real food, not just fruit and water. Sam's shoulders tensed slightly, a subtle movement that spoke volumes about years of learned wariness around accepting help. Matthew recognized it as the same stubborn pride he'd seen in James countless times, the same resistance to anything that might feel like charity. "I know a place," Matthew said carefully, deliberately casual. "Small Italian restaurant, family-owned. Your father and I used to go there back when—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Back when we still did things like that." The mention of James shifted something in Sam's expression. "Dad talked about Italian food sometimes," he said softly. "Said the best meal he ever had was at a place in New York with his brother. Said they had these meatballs that tasted like clouds." Matthew's breath caught. "Mama Rose's," he whispered. "On Sullivan Street." James always said the meatballs floated. A memory surfaced. James, much younger, laughing as he tried to convince Matthew that the meatballs must have helium in them to be so light. It had been one of their last good days together, before money and ambition had driven a wedge between them. "It's still there," Matthew continued, his voice rougher than he intended. "Rose's granddaughter runs it now, but the recipes haven't changed." He stood up, decision made. "But first, we need to get you some clothes." Sam looked down at his worn attire, self-consciousness crossing his face. "I'm fine, really. I've got a nephew of mine," Matthew interrupted firmly, "is not going to dinner in clothes that belong in a dumpster." He softened his tone at Sam's flinch. "Besides, your father would never let me hear the end of it if he knew I'd taken you to Mama Rose's looking like you'd just wrestled a garbage compactor." The mention of James in present tense hung between them, a shared hope neither dared to examine too closely. Sam's fingers twisted in the hem of his ragged shirt, then stilled. He looked up at Matthew with those eyes that were so like his father's, filled with a mixture of wariness and want. "I can't pay you back," he said quietly, dignity in every word. Matthew felt something in his chest crack and heal simultaneously. "You already have," he replied, surprising himself with the truth of it. "Now come on, I know a place that's still open." The private elevator carried them down to the garage, where Matthew bypassed the Bentley for a more subdued BMW. As they pulled into traffic, he watched Sam from the corner of his eye, the boy's face pressed against the window, taking in the city with the heightened awareness of someone used to reading streets for survival. The boutique Matthew chose was discreet, used to handling wealthy clients who valued privacy. The owner, Antonio, took one look at the odd pair they made and, to his credit, didn't blink. He simply nodded at Matthew's quiet explanation and began bringing out clothes in Sam's size. Sam handled each item as if it might dissolve in his hands, checking price tags when he thought Matthew wasn't looking. His eyes widened at the numbers, and he tried to protest, but Matthew was adamant. "Think of it as 13 years of missed birthday presents," he said, watching as Sam reluctantly tried on a soft cashmere sweater that made him look his age for the first time. "Besides, your father would want you to be warm." The shopping took less time than Matthew expected. Sam chose the simplest options available, gravitating toward dark colors and practical cuts. Even with Matthew's encouragement, he refused anything too flashy or expensive looking. His selection spoke of someone used to trying to blend in to avoid attention. When Sam emerged from the dressing room in dark jeans, a charcoal sweater, and proper shoes, the transformation was striking. Clean and properly dressed, the resemblance to James was even more apparent. Matthew had to look away for a moment, composing himself. "Better?" Sam asked, tugging slightly at the sweater's sleeve. "Much," Matthew replied, his voice gruff with emotion. "Now about those meatballs." The drive to Sullivan Street was quiet, both of them processing the day's events. The city had shifted into its evening rhythm, streets filling with people heading home or out for the night. Sam watched them all, his face reflecting in the window like a ghost overlaying the passing scenes. Mama Rose's looked exactly as Matthew remembered it. A narrow storefront with red and white checkered curtains and a neon sign that had probably been there since the 1950s. The smell of garlic and basil wafted out when he opened the door, triggering memories so vivid they almost knocked him back a step. Maria, Rose's granddaughter, recognized him immediately despite his years of absence. Her eyes widened at the sight of Sam, and Matthew saw the moment she made the connection. The boy's resemblance to James was too strong to miss. "Mr. Sterling," she said warmly, though her eyes held questions. "Your usual table is always ready." She led them to a booth in the back, the same one where he and James had spent countless evenings years ago, planning their futures over plates of pasta and glasses of wine, or in James's case, at least initially Coca-Cola. Sam slid into the seat, his new clothes still stiff with tags barely removed, his eyes taking in every detail of the restaurant. "The meatballs," Matthew said before Maria could hand the menus, "and the linguine with clam sauce, and garlic bread, and—" He looked at Sam. "What else did your father love here?" Sam's face lit up with recognition. "The tiramisu," he said softly. "He used to talk about it, said it was like eating clouds dipped in coffee." Maria's eyes glistened. "James always did have a way with descriptions," she said, her voice thick with memory. "Just bring it up, and some antipasto to start. Those boys always came in hungry." She hurried away, dabbing at her eyes with her apron. Sam watched her go, then turned to Matthew. "She knew him?" "My dad." Matthew nodded, his throat tight. "We came here at least once a week for years. Maria used to slip him extra dessert when Rosa wasn't looking. Though Rosa always knew, she just pretended not to notice." The food began arriving, plate after plate of memories made tangible. Matthew watched as Sam took his first bite of a Mama Rosa meatball, saw his eyes widen in recognition of a taste he'd only known through his father's stories. "They really do taste like clouds," Sam whispered, and for a moment, he looked exactly like James at 13, discovering the magic of roses cooking for the first time. As they ate, Matthew found himself sharing stories about James that he'd locked away for years. Tales of their childhood, of summer adventures and winter mishaps, of the brother who had always seen the world differently than Matthew did. Sam absorbed every word, occasionally offering his own memories of James, more recent, more painful, but threaded through with the same love that colored Matthew's recollections. The restaurant grew quieter as the evening wore on, other diners finishing their meals and departing. But Matthew and Sam remained in their booth, surrounded by empty plates and full hearts, building a bridge between past and present with each shared story. As Maria brought out the tiramisu, setting it between them with tears barely contained, Matthew realized something fundamental had shifted in his world. The fortune he'd spent years accumulating suddenly seemed like nothing more than numbers on paper compared to the wealth of connection he was rediscovering in this simple Italian restaurant with his brother's son. The price of his fortune had been steep, but perhaps the dividends were only now beginning to pay out, not in dollars and cents, but in something far more valuable: the chance to rebuild what had been lost, to right old wrongs, and to help a boy who had crossed the city carrying nothing but hope find not just his father, but a family he never knew he had. As Sam savored his dessert, his face reflecting the same joy James had shown in this very booth decades ago, Matthew began to plan. He had resources, connections, the ability to move mountains of money and influence. Surely, he could use those same tools to find one man who had disappeared into the vast tapestry of the city. The search for James would begin tomorrow, but tonight was for memories and meatballs, for stories, and the simple miracle of family finding its way back together across years of silence and separation. The real work lay ahead, but in this moment, in this restaurant that held so much of their shared history, Matthew and Sam were laying a foundation for whatever might come next. Outside, the city continued its endless dance, but inside Mama Rose's, time moved to the rhythm of shared stories and rediscovered connections, each moment adding another layer to the complex tapestry of family being rewoven one memory at a time.